organizers for inviting me. Thank you to all of you who have already presented yesterday. It has been truly inspiring. I thought we've seen a lot of good research, a lot of good ideas, a lot of good teaching, and I hope I can add a little bit to that with the work that I'll be presenting. It is mostly my own work, but always in collaboration with other people. So I've taken the advantage of supervising quite a few extremely talented PhD students, and along my presentation today, I will take you through their work as well. As Carola already said, my background is from task-based language teaching, and also newly now I added dynamic usage-based pedagogy to it, which basically means that you teach language by means of meaningful tasks with a focus on communication. And the teacher in that role has the role of providing a safe learning context, but also creating opportunities for learning. And this all is based on the idea that if we understand how and why learning happens, we can be better teachers. I would like to highlight a specific project that I was engaged in together with Steve Thorne, who will be presenting this later today. We call it the Synergies Project. What we were working towards is we collected 17 scholars from all around the world, so from Oceania, Asia, Latin America, Northern America, Europe, and we brought together these people and asked them, so if you're studying second language acquisition and teaching, irrespective of if you work in sociocultural framework, psycholinguistic, generative, what is it that you agree on? So they had a very hard task to not disagree, but actually say what they share. And a few of the synergies that we brought forward was that second language acquisition and teaching is a unique and individual experience. It is complex and multifactorial. And because of that, we actually need multi-method research, because only then we can actually tap into the insights. Because what we need to do in the end is teach the process, not the product. And that all in the context of whether language learning happens in the individual, in the classroom, but also in the wider societal and political context that we are working in. And AI is just one of those other societal contexts that has been open to us recently. In my heart, I'm also a writing researcher. Writing is something extremely powerful for second language learning. There are these notions of learning to write, but also writing to learn. And the beauty of writing is that it slows down learning, because it remains on paper or on the screen. You have time to think about what you actually want to do. You have time to monitor when what you have written is actually what you intended to write. So for language learning, this is beautiful, because it expands it creates opportunities for expanding your second language knowledge, for strengthening your for-use meaning mappings, and in that sense, writing to learn language, as Rosa Machon brought forward, is extremely powerful for every language learning. Over the years, a lot of models have been brought forward about how writing works, and I think some of you, or most of you, will be familiar with the models by Flower and Hayes, Révész Michel, the newest one by Galbraith and Mai, and I can recommend it to you because it really brings a new perspective. In my own writing research, I've quite often worked with Kellogg. And basically, we have those very simple distinctions between formulation processes, execution processes, monitoring processes. During formulation, you plan, you translate. During execution, you put it onto paper, either by typing or handwriting. And in monitoring, you dedicate time to reading and editing. Now, in the planning stage, it's not just about what you want to write, but also how you want to organize it. And in the translation stage, once you know what you actually want to do, you can put it on paper by kind of trying to find the words that you need, the syntactic structures that you need, and then create a cohesive text. What we know from research is that this is a highly iterative, recursive, dynamic process. So that's why I have actually come to prefer this model. It's the same as we saw before, but it really is something that keeps moving. And we also know that this highly dynamic and iterative process is specifically dynamic if we look at good writers. Good writers spend a lot of time on planning and they spend a lot of time on monitoring, but it always feeds back into the processes before. And for second language writing, this means that it really is a motor to push learning. And it is an eye-opener for language awareness because it gives you time to think. And here's some time to read. So, by the chuckles, I guess you started or you've reached the end. Now the question is, what actually happens when we add AI to our writing processes? And in order to do that, I would like to talk you through the research in my lab with my people. First, I would like to focus a little bit on the product. So quite often, or mostly what we actually see happening in the second language classroom is still this. People write texts and they receive feedback on the product. Some more innovative people might use a rubric and they kind of look at, okay, so how can we assess this more holistically? In research into second language writing, we have started to rely a lot on CAF measures, measures of complexity, accuracy, and fluency. Complexity refers to the size, range of language use in terms of structures and vocabulary. So basically how big, how large your linguistic repertoire is. Accuracy is what we know, it's the errors, so how close are you to the norm. Fluency is how smooth and fast and easy you can produce language. There's been a whole lot of additions in the blue boxes here where people said, oh, we need measures of morphological complexity, grammatic complexity. We need measures that can better tap into beginner learners who actually most of the time still use their native language. We need measures that actually measure interactional fluency. And we definitely need measures that are able to look at other languages than English, because there's this massive bias to English, so that we actually in the field talk about LOTE, languages other than English. This already explains what we do. So, one new addition in the field has been introduced by Gauken and Feder, and they said, okay, actually, apart from those complexity, accuracy, and fluency measures, what really counts in a communicative approach is functional adequacy. Do you actually meet the task requirements? And to give you an example from their work, they have here two tasks, or a task given to students and asking them, okay, so write to a resident at the university explaining where do you want to stay during your study abroad. And if you look at the first task completion, it already says in the first sentence that, and I would like to stay on your international student residence. So the first task, basically, the task has already been completed. Now the second completion, or the second task, is a whole set of arguments why option 1 doesn't work, option 2 doesn't work, option 3 doesn't work, and in the end, no one knows what they actually want. So functionally, this is not a good task completion. And one of my PhD students, Fred Sickens, he doesn't look like a student in that sense that he has been a German teacher for 40 years and decided, now I want to do my PhD. We have this program where teachers are actually supported to do PhD research in their own classrooms. So this is what Fred has started to do. And he looked at whether engaging in writing tasks actually supports speaking. Based on this idea that when you do writing, you have time, you can actually focus on form, it raises your awareness, and in that sense it really can be a motor to push language learning. And he used those CAFA measures, so complexity, accuracy, fluency, and functional adequacy. In his initial project, or in his initial pilot study, he only looked at a very small group, a writing group and a speaking group, and he actually did see that measuring on how they became better in a pre-post test on speaking, when they have been trained on writing, He saw that they became more fluent, more lexically diverse, but they lost a little bit of syntactic complexity. The speaking group only grew in lexical diversity. Now, and in functionality, actually there was no difference. The take home for writing research here is that engaging in writing tasks supports speaking development. And that is something that we can think of when we think of large classrooms where it can be quite daunting to have everyone chat at the same time, or where they actually will go back to their L1 very quickly. So if you engage in writing, it's silent, and you will actually have a written product that is in the target language. He's following up this study, much larger, with more than 100 students that engage in 5 of those task cycles, and keep an eye on what he's publishing, because this is what he's still working on. Now, in my own research, I've been collaborating with people from Cambridge and Tübingen University. We looked into the EF-CAMDAT. EF-CAMDAT is a big corpus that is based on English First language learners, the online platform. And it consists of 1.2 million texts by 280,000 writers. And it is from A1 to C2 level. So what do the students do, or the people do there? They engage in a set of lessons, and at the end of every lesson, they have a free writing task. Like you see the example here. A friend asks you to recommend some clothing, what should I buy? Now, what we looked at is whether in this corpus, on the one hand side, how do people develop over time? But then also, can we see any task effects? Because tasks were very different. Some tasks were much more instructive, others were more narrative, others were more argumentative. And what we found is that some measures are really nicely developmental. So if you look at the average sentence length, for example, you see that it is really going basically from A1 to C2, quite a straight line up. But then, if you look at the use of past tense verbs, there's nothing like development in here. And actually, when we look at them, we gather together the tasks that are narrative, the tasks that are descriptive, the tasks that are more professional. We saw that on those measures, they mingled together. So the task type defined how they were actually developing. And we did this first for 6 tasks, but then for all 128 tasks that were included in that corpus, and we saw very clear task effects, and only some of the measures were actually really developmental. So the take home here is, products are a snapshot, so they only give you one perspective. Task type has an influence, proficiency has an influence, and not all measures are reliable. Now, another project at Groningen University, not my own, but of a very talented young scholar, May Wu, supervised by Rasmus Steinkaus and Anna Lowy, they work within the complex dynamic system theory, where you say, okay, actually, you cannot look at groups, and you cannot look at one moment in time, because language learning is a trajectory, and it's dynamic, and it's developmental. So she looked at what is the reliability of a single task writing assessment rated with different CAF measures. And she looked at whether the topic affected this. And the design was that on day 1, they wrote 3 times a task. 10 days later, they wrote a 4th task. Again, 10 days later, a 5th task. Again, 10 days later, a 6th task. And she measured all those CAF. Here is the complexity, syntactic complexity, accuracy, fluency. Now, single tasks and topics did not give a good impression of where we're going. And also, measures were extremely unreliable. The only thing that really could work basically were those very global complexity measures where you say, okay, so how diverse is the vocabulary that is used? On to next. Mo. Mo Salama is based in Egypt, and he works in an academic context where he is an EAP teacher. And he came to me and Révész Michel, my colleague at Groningen University, and says, actually, I want to use the CDST perspective, this complex dynamic systems perspective, to look into how writing develops over time in my classes. And we helped him to come up with a curriculum that is truly task-based, that is truly oriented. So he has this dynamic usage-based TBLT framework that we are allowed to publish in Task Journal. So it's coming out any moment, we're waiting eagerly for it. And it's very much based on input-based tasks that are reiterated and iterated and iterated and iterated. And they allow for personalized learning trajectories, and the focus is very much on use. So not on error correction or grammar teaching, but really on how do they use it. Now, what Mo has been doing is with each of those timestamps that he has 9 timestamps over time, he looked at if we measure syntactic complexity, lexical diversity, accuracy, fluency, and functional adequacy, how do they correlate? So do they move together? If someone grows in accuracy, do they also grow in complexity? Or actually do they maybe interact negatively? Now anything that is blue is negative correlation, so they do not work in parallel. Anything that is red is a positive correlation, so they develop hand in hand. And this is worked together also for an language school. This is at time 1. But if we look at this from time 1 to 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, you see there's development. So 1, 2, 3, it's still quite mixed. All of a sudden at 4, it all seems to come together. So there's some moment of stabilization that gets mixed up a little bit together. And then by the end of time 9, accuracy, fluency, complexity, and functional adequacy, they come together and they have actually stabilized here. And we can show that also in the line graph, where you have here accuracy as a yellow line and functional adequacy and fluency as purple lines, blue lines. And you see that actually accuracy quite often is opposite of the others. And then when the yellow line drops, the blue line goes up. And only towards the end, they come together. So how do we expect that our students develop like a line up if actually the trajectory is like this? And if you look at individuals, this is how it looks for each individual. None of them follows the exact line of the group. The take home of all this is that writing is dynamic. Variability is a sign of development. You saw that at some point it started moving in, and then only it stabilized. Development is highly individual. A short wrap up. So from this product-based research, we saw that engaging in writing tasks supports speaking development. Products are only a snapshot, and are affected by task type and proficiency. Measures are not always reliable. Single tasks and topics do not give a good impression. Complexity is better evaluated by global measures, and writing is dynamic, individual, variable. So, something happened to my text. Here it is. What happens when we add AI to this picture? I think we have to use writing, for example, with a chatbot, like I did yesterday, to support speaking development. It's a safe environment, and that's our task as a teacher. We have to be careful with product evaluations, specifically if we only use it at one point and only with one topic and only with one measure, because we might pick the wrong one and we really do not do a favor to our students. So by now, with having AI at hand, we can use those automatic tools to run texts through and get at different measures, and that also show to students where are you actually. Your accuracy might be lost, but if you look at your complexity, you're growing. So that's something we can really do nowadays with all the tools that are available. And I've personally used often the Vaillant tool. That is a very easy tool to show lexical diversity and sophistication growth. Super easy, works with a lot of languages. Nice to do. Okay, I promised to look into writing processes. And over the past years, I've worked a lot with my colleague Andrea Révész at University of on innovations and writing process research. And the innovations that we brought ourselves are that we combined different methods. So, so far, a lot of writing process research used introspective methods, keystroke logging, eye tracking, but they've rarely been used in combination, and that's what we have been doing. Keystroke logging is a moment-to-moment information of what keys have been pressed. So it tells you what letters actually were used, when and where pauses happened, at what locations and how long they were. And it also gives you some information about how you, and what kind of revisions you did. And it gives you beautiful information about the speed fluency, about pausing behavior, and revision behaviors. So how much, for example, of the text typed in the blue line remains in the green line in the final text. And that can also be a measure. Eye tracking, some of you are probably familiar with it, is a method where we measure where people look at in order to understand what they're processing. The idea is what they're looking at is what they're currently doing in their brain. And to give you an example, here we see someone who's pausing at the end of a clause and reads back in the sentence. So you see their eye movements here remain in the sentence. Whereas in this example, there's a pause, and the person really goes through all the text to kind of see, okay, so what am I currently doing? And even scrolls. In this example, they have a pause and they go back into instruction to kind of see, okay, what am I monitoring at what am I doing right now? Now, in our research, we looked at different task types. These are IELTS, TOEFL tests, and if you're familiar with it, you have one set where you just get a prompt and you have to write a text, and another where you have to listen to a text, you read the text, and then you have to write. Now, what we did, we also used something called stimulated recall. So people engaged in the writing process, and when they finished, we asked them to engage in retrospective think aloud protocols. And everything they were saying, we transcribed it and we had it coded along those processes in the Kellogg model. So that people engage in lexical retrieval, syntactic encoding, or monitoring. The monitoring example is just like, I just wanted to check if the second paragraph was complete and if there was anything else to add. As said, we've published quite a lot of papers on this, and where we look at effects of proficiency, task type, working memory. And the idea is always that we want to know what processes do writers engage in. Does it differ in stages at the beginning, middle, or end of the process? And how does proficiency actually feed into this whole model and task type? If you look at task type, like stimulated recall patterns, you see here stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, so throughout the writing process. You see that the translation parts, the lighter gray ones, in both the independent tasks, so just with the topic, and the integrated task with the listening and reading text, the light gray bars are as similarly big in both. But you also see that in the integrated task, a lot is actually taken up by resource use. So the darker gray is where they actually go back to the source text and mine from there. And in both tasks, you see by stage 5, people engage in monitoring. That's when they go back, do I actually, is the text what I wanted to write? Now in general, if we look at proficiency effects in those, in that research, we see that more proficient writers wrote faster, produced shorter pauses, pause more frequently. We could not see anything on the IA state or the stimulated recall. But when we took those stages into account, we saw that they wrote slower in the last stage and paused longer in the last stage. So there was more monitoring happening. We also saw that they produced shorter main fixations in later stages. So they were moving. And the stimulated recall showed that in the beginning there was more planning, and in the later stages there was more monitoring as proficiency grew. And to show this in a graph, here you see in the lines, the colored lines are the different stages. So stage 1, stage 2, 3, 4, 3 and 4, you see, it's actually steadily going up. But stage 5 flattens. And that basically shows that with growing proficiency, people spend more time on monitoring in the end. And that's exactly what we know. Better raters know when to slow down in order to plan or to monitor what they have written. But in general, up to 50% of what second-language writers are doing is based on translation processes. So putting my ideas into words, sentences, and a coherent text. Resource use takes up to half of those processes. Next. Annie Heisterkamp has an extremely interesting project where she looks at Dutch medium and English medium instruction in the Netherlands and how people actually, students write in English and in Dutch. She has a whole set of it, but I will only highlight one of that. Because she also again looked at source use. So how much do people draw on the sources they receive? And she saw that actually the extent of source use did not affect text quality. So whether they did draw on the source or not, you could not see in the product any effects of that. There were no differences in general between L1 Dutch or L2 English processes, which probably is, I mean, Dutch students are at equally high English level as most Swedish students, so that was just not an issue for that. But again, I think it is important that there is no such link between source use and quality. Now, someone who zooms in on source use is Xiaoman Yang. She's a talented PhD student at the South China University of Technology, and the past year she's been visiting Groningen University to work with me. She works on linguistic alignment, uses a whole set of data, methodologies, and she works within something that's called the reading-writing integrated continuation task. So this is a powerful writing task they have implemented throughout Asia, and it basically gives you a source to write, to read, and asks you to continue the writing, so to continue the story. And here it is a story about a little girl and her adopted brother, and basically they read the text, and then in 2 text boxes they have to write the continuation. And she is eye tracking to see what happens. So just a little reference to Joe. If you actually look what happens when people engage in writing, it looks like spaghetti. But with the right technologies and the right statistical methods, we can make use of it and find some results. So what Xiaoman has found is that a lot of the texts that people wrote were aligned with the source text. So they had been mining that. And when they did, we can see that in the ai measures, that actually the little phrases that they have been using, that's where they deliberately looked at. And I say deliberately, because here with the percentage numbers, you can see that actually most of the students were also aware. They could report afterwards, this is what I used, this is what I used, this is what I used. So when writing, L2 writers build on the source use they have. And they use it both in implicit ways, so some they just do without noticing, but a lot of it is actually strategic and automatic. Xijing, another one, she's just started and she's looking at longitudinal development of second language writing, taking into account tasks, proficiency, and individual differences. And she works with keystroke logging throughout a process of 13 task completions. Now, Xijing had a major hiccup in trying to get around those data because her students were at a very low level and they forgot to put the space between the period mark and the next sentence. And that basically screwed up the input log program. So she's been busy the past month at finding out how to overcome this, and that's why I don't have results. Keep an eye on her. Instead, I have results of Mona Maya. She works with Vanessa de Wilde and Lieve Makke at Ghent University, and I'm an external advisor on her project. And she specifically looks at genAI practices of student writers. And what she is interested in, and what I can show you here, is she looked at how AI how writers begin to actually use genAI without any instruction. And whether that has an impact, again, on the product, yes or no. Now, what we found, or what she found, is that participants displayed actually an extremely varied pre-existing genAI usage. And we've seen lots of talks about that yesterday. People say, oh, it only gave me a little bit of information. And others said, yeah, no, it gave me more ideas and helped me with signal words, how I could make it better. Students are not the same. And the interesting is that we only saw a very small effect of lexical diversity and sophistication, but there was no real structured link between the AIUs and those CAF measures. So there were limited CAF effects, large individual differences based on individual unique AIUs. What can we learn from all that process research? We have seen that up to 50% goes to translation. Source use takes half of this. More proficient writers know when to do what and how effectively. The extent of source use does not often affect the quality, and we did not see differences between native and non-native writing. When writers build on source use, they use implicit and explicit processes, and there are large individual differences in that AI use. So, if we add in the AI picture here, using sources influences writing, and AI may just be another source. So it is added, and people will add it. More versatile AI users will know when and how to employ it in an effective way. So how can we ensure that people become versatile AI users? A product lens does not tell us much about AI use. You see how much we learn from looking at processes, zooming in on what they actually do, instead of looking what they produce at the end. We do know that AI use will influence processes both in an implicit, automatic, and in an explicit, strategic way. So lots of work to do. I also looked a little bit into collaborative writing. And a lot of my earlier research was focusing on text chat. So what do people do when they chat with each other, specifically in a second language? Again, I used eye tracking. Here you see an example where someone is typing, I think I'm not able to find the groups. And actually they look back at their partner who had written before, I'm trying to find the groups. So people do use their sources. I used stimulated recall interviews, where one of the respondents actually said, yeah, I definitely used that specific phrase that my tutor had used in the earlier sentence. I had first written mena, but then I changed it to männliche fans, following the example of the tutor. So our language users are strategic. They know what they're doing manually. And in the research on text chat, I found that students align, they report, they're aware that they do that. They feel that they can learn from peers when they engage in this. And actually with the eye gaze, I could show that up to 72% was really drawn on explicit attention to it. So people had looked at the text that they were using. And there were a lot of strategic reasons why they choose to align or not to align. So someone even started saying, oh, I saw the same smiley, so I thought let's use the same smiley because we were diverting somewhere and I thought I wanted to smooth it down again. So from this research, we know that when chatting, L2 users use all the available sources, their peers, their tutors, their task material, and they do that both in an implicit and an explicit way. Look at this happy chap. This is Laura Schlieffenhofer. She started her PhD with me when I was still at Lancaster University, and she graduated a month ago. Carola was in her committee, and she did tremendous work on collaborative writing. This is how her setup looks. She had people work on a graph description task, an academic graph description. They had a collaborative writing pane where they engaged in collaborative text generation, and they had a chat pane where they could actually discuss with each other what to do. It was quite an extensive study with a large-scale study, a focus study, where she looked into those interaction patterns, how it relates to text quality. She was eager to capture engagement and look into learner attitudes and perceptions. It's a typical multi-method, multi-source approach, so she also used something like Docus, where in Google Docs you can see who contributed when what. So the yellow lines or the orange lines are of one writer and the blue lines are of the second writer. So it gives you an impression who did what during the process. She used those eye-gaze measures where you see that there are huge differences on tasks. Task 1 in blue, task 2 in green. How often people actually look at the text of their partner. And she used simulated recall to also get into the thought processes. And just as an example of monitoring processes that you can't see, but you can get when they verbalize them, Lee reports here that she was reading her partner's argument and then realized, oh, actually, I should go back into my own text and rewrite that. So it was monitoring based on what she had been reading in her partner's text. Now, she also used Storch's model. Some of you are probably familiar with it, of mutuality and equality. And she looked at those interactional dimensions, but based on her idea or on her data. So she tried the top model, but actually she did a cluster analysis, so data-driven bottom-up analysis, and she found that there are only 2 dimensions. So what she showed is that the shared text is a shared space of reflection, where people monitor each other and engage with the text, even if they're not typing. So sometimes it's like, oh, this person has not contributed. But actually what she could show through the eye gaze was that people have been looking back and forth. But the willingness to actually engage and correct their partner's text was very much based on whether they had been trained on doing that before or not, because some were quite reluctant on that. And there was no systematic process product link. So what people were doing was not reflective in equality in the end. Now, in our own work, together with Carola also, we looked at patterns in collaborative grading. And we used ChatGPT here in quite a nice setup also together with Niklas Abel and Irina Vashutkina. And we had people write the text first individually. We gave them ChatGPT models that were quite bad, actually. And said, okay, so compare what you've written yourself and a ChatGPT model. We gave them some guidance on that. And then they had time to revise their own work. And they first did that on an individual basis, and then they also did that in a collaborative setting. Now, what we saw is that students noticed that their own output was linguistically not as good as the ChatGPT. But content-wise, they were actually quite good. And they gained confidence in actually checking that, hey, even though I'm a language learning, I know what I'm doing because I have content knowledge. What we also saw is that a lot of the revision processes were actually triggered by the peers discussing with each other, hey, shall we revise this? And to give you an example, this depended on how the pairs were put together. So here we have someone that was a bit more dominant and someone was a bit passive. They had 44 minutes, but there was not a lot of engagement actually. It was little interaction. It was mainly student 1 typing and student 2 watching and sometimes dictating some changes. And in the blue, you see an example of their exchanges. That's not what we want, is it? Now, if you look at pair C, that was clearly a collaborative pair, that lively interaction, engaging with each other's suggestion, and while discussing content and structure with genAI models, they really talked and focused on form, and they learned. And you see already in their interaction and use of time that they are working at high levels of language. So the take home of this, that pairing shapes AI use and ethical reflection. we did see in here that we do still need a human in the lead. If you have a passive and a dominant pair, you will not get what you want to. Good students are good AI users, again. So, taking together this collaborative writing settings, we see that when chatting, L2 writers use all available sources. We see that engagement comes in different ways. The shared text is a space of reflection, but pairing shapes what you can actually see. So if we add AI to the picture, using sources influences writing, and AI is yet another source. AI use will influence processes both in an implicit and in a strategic way. A process lens will tell you a lot more about AI use than just looking at the product. And more collaborative pairs will be more versatile AI users, and they will know when and how to employ it. So, the insight of my own L2 writing research and that of all my collaborators is that second language writing is an extremely exciting way of looking at second language development. I think it's worthwhile taking into account individual trajectories, task effects, the measures you use, and realize that there's a highly dynamic interplay of all these factors. So I'm, after 7 years being at Groningen University, I'm finally in the CDST crowd. Writing in collaborative settings is beneficial, at least if the partners collaborate. Collaboration and engagement comes in very different ways. The processing lens gives us much more insights than products, and the triangulation of all those different methods also helps us in getting deeper understanding. So what do we say if people come to us and say, oh, but during planning, you need higher order level thinking, translation, it's when you really do the lexical retrieval, that's the language work. Execution, and you saw my students shooting, they needed to learn that there's a space after the period mark. Monitoring engages students in deep reflection and focus. So don't let the machine do the work. I mean, you wouldn't subscribe to a gym and then hope that actually your muscles grow by themselves without you going there. But as we know, we all do that. If you subscribe, you never go, and you remain as is. Yeah. The question is, how can we draw on AI in the different stages and in different contexts in a fruitful and versatile way? And going back to the very first quote from our Synergies project, if we teach the process and we look at multiple contexts, multi-method, complex multifactorial, we are able to look at the unique and individual experiences of our language learners. So if we understand how, why, and when learning might happen, we are better teachers. So my claim will always be use a process lens and help students to become versatile AI users that know when and how to employ it, and also when not. So, I didn't use Claude. So, this is my language learning team, the teachers that together with me teach 8 different languages at Groningen University. I'm extremely proud of them because they matter. We are teachers and we never stop. And I think we are needed because in the end, language learning is humanization.